evening and welcome to my presentation on culture as a fundamental explanation of economic growth. This is a three-part presentation, so let's start with part one right away. What is the motivation for this presentation, for this lecture? The motivation lies deep into the theory of economic growth. The advent of that theory came in mid-last century, but the initial growth theories were theories of growth, economic growth mechanics, and they did not provide fundamental explanations of economic growth, why economic growth happens. Now, the advanced theories of economic growth, which came in the last decade of the previous century, and these are basically models of endogenous growth, models specified by Romer in 1990 and Aghion and Howitt in 1992, they created a framework for consideration of what can be labeled as micro-foundations of economic growth. Actually, the economic growth is considered within the framework of behavior of economic agents. So the crucial question is why economic agents behave in one or the other way. There are two approaches to that question, two approaches and two fundamental explanations of economic growth. Fundamental because they explain behavior of economic agents. One approach is based on institutions as the fundamental explanation, and the most important contributions in that area are actually contributions by Douglas North in 1990, then Acemoglu and al. In 2005, and Afner Grief in 2006. The other approach is the approach of culture, like contributions of David Landis in 1998, Spallore and Weisigar in 2013, and Joel Mokyr in 2017. Now, the main research question for this presentation is, with institutions being accepted as a fundamental explanation of economic growth, whether and to what extent institutions and culture are alternative or complementary fundamental explanation of growth. If they are alternatives, which of these two explanations is superior? And then there is a side question. Is there a misunderstanding rather than disagreement between proponents of institutions and culture as the fundamental explanation of economic growth? The structure of these presentations is that at the very beginning we will start with the problem of definition and institutions versus culture is very important to specify the definitions. The importance is of being precise rather than earnest this time. Then in the second part, we will deal with the outcomes of institutions and culture, with motives and constraints to human behavior. In the part 3 of this presentation, we will discuss the changing engines of growth. So the possibility that perhaps the relations between institutions and the culture changes with moving towards technological frontier. Now, some conclusion will be made, whether they are complementary after all, institutions and the culture, as fundamental explanations of economic growth. And finally, some guidelines for future research will be provided. Now, as to the definition of institutions, It is Douglas North who provided his famous definition of institutions as the humanely devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interactions. In other words, the rules of the game that shapes human interactions. Now, it is important to spot that institutions are only constraints to maximizing behavior of economic agents. They are both formal, like laws, or informal, like social norms or self-imposed code of conduct or moral norms, with the same purpose. And there is additivity of formal and informal norms, meaning that they are not countervailing each other. Now, because they are norms, there are also sanctions for breaching the rules. And these sanctions can be both external, in case of law, and or social norms. So they're imposed by the society, or can be internal in case of morality. Now, what is important is that institutions are nothing natural. They are humanly devised. And there is no specification of the process and the area of these constraints. As to the process, they can be made top-down or bottom-up. As to the area, they can be political, economic, legal, etc. Now, the main feature of institutions is that they are creating incentives that are negative. Institutions can explain why people are not doing something rather than why people are doing something. So the other specific issue of institutions, specific feature, is that they address only human interactions, i.e., it is exchange only that institutions provide incentives to. They do not address individual internal life. For example, relations of the individual with the nature or God. Being religious or not being religious is exactly the issue of internal life of an individual, and institutions have got nothing to do with it. They do not provide explanation for the motives of the individuals for their behavior. So, taking into account these features of institutions, one could formulate two conjectures. Number one, within the same institutional framework, different people have different behavior. And conjecture number two, institutions have only limited explanatory capacity for economic growth or wider economic outcomes. Now, we come to the definition of culture. Of course, there is a long list of definitions of culture. Some of them are very comprehensive, and as comprehensive they are, perhaps more they are murky and nebulous. So I've selected one of Joel Mokyr and his 2017 contribution, and I believe that is a proper definition of culture, not the only one, but the proper, at least for this presentation. So, according to Joel Mokyr, culture is nothing but a set of beliefs, values, and preferences capable of affecting behavior that are socially transmitted and that are shared by some subset of society. And they are a matter of individual choice. So this is very comprehensive and, to my mind, very clear a straightforward definition of culture. Let's go through that definition for a moment. Now, it is beliefs that are a part of the culture. And beliefs are nothing but positive statements about the state of the world. So they are not normative, not value judgments, but very positive statements about what is around us, what the world around us looks like. The second component of culture is actually values. So they are normative statements about society and social relations. So these normative statements are basically something which is embodied in ethics and ideology. So this is how the society should look like, how social relations should look like, what should be rather than what it is. Finally, a part of culture are preferences, and preferences are normative statements about individual matters, about the consumption, but not only material consumption, it is about individual way of life, about the choices of individual. What makes someone happy? That is basically a matter of preferences. Now, there is important element in this definition. This is about social transmission. So culture is socially transmitted, and there is a vertical transmission from parents and elders to offspring. So this is upbringing process which defines culture of a generation, but also the culture is specified by horizontal transmission by peers. What is very important at the end of this long definition is freedom of choice. So this is individual choice. If someone decides to believe in God, for example, this is his/her individual choice. Now, there is important methodological problem, and that problem is linked to the overlapping notion. Is there a kind of overlapping between institutions and culture? Now, the point is that values, which are part of the culture, they create self-imposed code of conduct, not contact as mistakenly made in this PowerPoint presentation. So there are moral constraints, which are internal constraints, and that is basically Kantian categorical imperative, starry night above me and iron moral law inside me. So in that sense, culture can be an institution as a constraint, and informal institutions, which are not actually only moral norms, but in case of moral norms, there is internal sanction, which is guilt or sin or any feeling in between guilt and sin. This creates moral norms in the exchange. For example, a golden rule is a moral norm in the ethics of reciprocity. Beliefs about trust to other people can be a substitution for formal institutions. And for example, in a very important empirical paper from 2009 by 3 authors, it is extension of trust, and that provides high level of transactions for given institutions. So this is a kind of supplement to formal institutions. This empirical analysis is focused to Italy, and it specifies that the level of trust in northern Italy is much bigger than the level of trust in southern Italy. So although there is a unique institutional framework in terms of formal institutions in Italy, there is a different level of transactions, different level of exchange, which bigger level of exchange in the north due to a higher level of trust. Now, the crucial question, methodological question, is causality, whether it is culture that creates institutions, and that is notion of North 2005, the culture, values as scaffolds of institutions, or whether institutions could be a source of beliefs. And Putnam classical piece on Italy, it is argued that better institutions in Italian North created culture of trust. One way or the other, the relations between culture and institutions are very complicated, and there could be two-way causality as demonstrated by Alessina Giuliano in 2019 paper. So for the end of this part, let's do some comparison of institutions and culture. So institutions provide constraints, culture provide motives, also some constraints, partially. Then institutions are predominantly universal, either on the global level or on the national level with the national legal systems. Predominantly they are universal. On the other hand, culture is predominantly partial because it is culture of the groups, not the culture of the society as a whole, or on the individual level. Institutions, especially formal institutions, can be changed fast. So changes in formal institutions, various transitions are very fast. On the other hand, culture changes very, very slow. So there are very slow changes in culture. Institutions are endogenous to politics. There could be a political decision to change the legislation. Culture is exogenous to politics. So there is no political power which can change the culture. And with this comparison, I would like to conclude part one of the lecture. So soon I will come back to you with part two. Thank you very much. Welcome back. Let's continue our trip, our passage through culture as a fundamental explanation of economic growth. So let's go straight away to the second slide to discuss motives and constraints. So basically, in the previous part, we made a specific distinction between institutions who are providing constraints and culture that provides motives. Now, as to the motives, let's talk about preferences, because the preferences are our views about ourselves, our views of what makes us happy. And actually, it is the preferences that are the source of the motives. Economists would say this is the formulation of utility function. And what is in utility function is actually decision of every single individual. So one thing will make one person happy, but the very same thing will not make the other person happy because the preferences are different. So culture actually is about, among other things, about preferences, because let me remind you that the culture is about preferences, beliefs, and values. So it is part of the cultural model is actually preferences which enable each individual to formulate utility function. It is someone who is interested in material wealth only, in money, to put it in this way. There are many people who are also interested in some other things but material values. Now, the other component of culture is beliefs, that are beliefs about the world. And these beliefs about the world, how our world operates, that beliefs enable the transformation of preferences into specific aims. Without these beliefs, without our beliefs about the world that surrounds us, it will be just our preferences, nothing else. But it is these beliefs that enable each of us to formulate aims and to direct himself, herself towards these aims in a consistent behavior. Now, there are also values as the part of the culture. So values are the ground for selection of aims. So there are some forbidden fruits, there are some temptations, and it is values deeply embedded in culture that we have accepted that enable us to make a selection of these aims. So all three elements of culture actually creates motives. And motives are nothing but the driving force of economic agents, the driving force of their behavior. Now, it is very interesting to consider relations between motives on one side and constraints on the other side, and especially constraints created by institutions. And in his seminal contribution, Bowles' seminal contribution from 2016, Bowles actually considered deeply, profoundly, these relations between motives and constraints, motives and institutions. So there are basically three types of relations between motives and constraints. One is neutrality, so no relation at all. It is just additivity, as economists would say. Let's consider, as an example for that kind of relations, let's consider the relations between murder and capital punishment. So on the one hand, it is the culture that provides for most of the people, it is the culture that provides a barrier for murder, because this is based on the values and the selection of aims. But for those who are not prevented to commit murder, there are legal sanctions, i.e. institutions, like institution of capital punishment or life imprisonment, which provide deterrent to that kind of people, deterrent of committing murder. So there is additivity, there is no relation between motives on the one side, or culture, and institutions on the other side. They just add to each other. Now, there is another possible relations, which is in economic jargon, crowding in, or synergy. Economists would say also superadditivity. That means that one reinforces the other. Motives reinforce constraints. And typical kind of that reinforcement or superadditivity is within a labor relation. So on the one hand, there is labor ethics, and labor ethics is about hardworking, discipline, but there are also labor contracts, and labor contracts are about norms, about institutions, and the sanctions for breaking these institutions. So if there is a good labor ethics, then the labor contracts works well. and in the reverse order, if there are good labor contracts and good enforcement of the labor contracts, that re-enhance labor ethics. So there is superadditivity. The better one side is, it will make the other side also to be better. So this is a kind of positive relations between motives and constraints. But there could be crowding out, or what economists are actually talking about is a subadditivity. So the strong crowding out means that the effect of the institutions is more than offsetting the effect of motives. And there is a famous empirical case in kindergarten in Haifa, and that was described in details by Nisi and Rusticini in their 2000 paper. So what was the case in the kindergarten? So actually parents are late to collect children. They're late for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, for 15 minutes, you name it. And there is a burden on the staff of the kindergarten because they have to stay in the kindergarten longer than the operating hours. So being rather unhappy with that kind of behavior of the people, they introduced punishment. They introduced sanction that after half an hour, for example, after 15 minutes, there will be a fee. A fee will be imposed to anyone who comes later than 15 minutes to collect his offspring. Now, what actually happened is that the people decided to be late for 45 minutes, for 60 minutes, and so on, so on. So actually, their good behavior, because they have some kind of self-constraining behavior, and that self-constraint was limiting the amount of delay in collecting children, that was just crowded out by the sanctions. So the people were reasoning, now I have to pay one way or the other, so when I pay, then I will behave in proper way. I have no constraints in my motives. I have no selection of my aims anymore. It is interesting to discuss the issue of religion and secular beliefs that are relevant for economic outcomes and economic growth, of course. Perhaps the most famous argument is argument of Max Weber, Weberian argument on Protestant ethics, that it is the Protestant ethics who provided the background for success, for economic success of Protestant countries, for economic growth of predominantly Protestant countries, shall we put it this way. Now, basically, this Weberian argument is referring not to the Protestant ethics and Protestant confession, but actually to Calvinists and predestination for salvation, which is a part of Calvinist dogma. So it is basically exogenous, contrary to the Catholic Church, and not only Catholic Church, it's also Greek Orthodox Church. And when there is a confession and absolution of the sins after the confession. So in that sense, there is a predestination for salvation. Nothing can be done about it. Now, there is an obligation within that dogma. There is an obligation to believe that everyone is among the chosen one, demonstrating that by hard work and wealth gathering. So this is basically the mechanism of a Protestant ethic argument by Max Weber. It is now exactly 100 years after the publishing of the final version of his work. There were many empirical analyses providing some support or not providing some support for his thesis. But what is interesting is that it is not exactly the Protestant ethics which made Protestant countries more affluent than Catholic countries in Western Europe, for example, according to Becker and Westman and their 2009 article, which was empirical analysis of Germany, so a country with both congregations. It is actually the level of human capital which was higher, which has been higher, still is higher in the case of Protestant congregation, Protestant than Catholics, for obvious doctrinal reasons. Reading directly Bible and Gospel needs literacy. So basically, this is the argument, which is a kind of side effect argument, but we'll still know very little about that, actually, the actual impact of Protestant ethic to the economic outcome. What is interesting in completely secular area is his beliefs concerning income generation process. Is it hard working or luck? And there is a number of contributions mentioned here that demonstrated that actually it is the more widespread belief in hard work compared with the belief in luck that provides the ground for better economic outcomes. In one of the empirical works by Debke and Zilibotti in 2008, it is kind of dual belief, work versus luck, believe in work versus luck, and thriftness, and that is basically the feature of middle class, and that was used as the explanation of industrialization and demise of landed gentry. Now, what is also important to discuss within this framework, this is relations between culture and innovations. So in his seminal paper, a book actually, a very thick book, A Culture of Growth, Joel Mokyr, thick book that I recommend warmly. It's 2017 book. Is basically one of the findings is that no scientific or industrial revolution in Europe was possible without a cultural breakthrough from medieval religious dogmatic views. So religious dogma as a constraint to innovations, this is pretty intuitive, particularly if we go back to medieval times, to the history. But I mean, to what extent this is contemporary phenomenon? And it was two papers by Benabo and others, 2013 and 15, who demonstrated that actually the higher religiosity produces smaller number of patents per capita, and on micro level, on the individual level, there is a statistically significant relationship between dogma and less favorable view of innovation. So there is no religious creative destruction, one of the main mechanisms for economic growth. Now, who rules? Is it institutions or culture? So Acemoglu and Robinson, in their 2012 contribution, Why Nations Fail, very famous contribution, they made no concession to culture whatsoever. Culture is not an explanation. It's not important. So there are two natural experiments that they use. One is two Koreas, North and South, so the same culture, and two Nogaleses, Nogales, USA, Nogales, Arizona, USA, and Nogales, Mexico, Sonora. So this is actually the same city divided by the national border. So they're same culture with distinctive institutions. And South is more successful than North, and Nogales, USA is more successful than Mexico, than Nogales, Mexico. But when my natural experiment that I would like to point out to is the transition of Central and Eastern Europe. So in Central and Eastern Europe, they are nowadays, or for some time, there have been some formal institutions, the same very formal institutions as in the Western Europe, especially with the EU accession, but with different culture and with completely different outcomes. So Poland does not look like the Netherlands, although to the great extent, formal institutions are the same. Now, I do believe that the question is not appropriate. The question who rules is not appropriate. And I do believe that economic outcomes can be explained by both institutions and culture, and there should be some kind of division of labor between institutions and culture, because complex economic outcomes, like economic growth, they deserve good and well-balanced rather than simple explanation. And that concludes the second part of this presentation. Thank you. Welcome back to the part 3, and let's start right away. The important issue in growth economics is changing engines of growth. The point is that engines of growth are different on different levels of economic development. And on the basic level of economic development, growth is investment-based. So it is accumulation of capital, investments, and engagement of the idle part of the labor force that matters. And crucial preconditions for high expected returns on capital and high expected returns on capital are necessary condition for investment. That is the rule of law institutions that will protect that return on capital. This is the basic engine of growth for the countries that are far from the technological frontier, i.e. countries that are not very economically developed. Poor countries, if you like. Then it is important that the productivity increase in that level of technological development is due to division of labor. So it is one-off increase of total factor productivity. When you divide labor nationally and internationally, that is exactly what happened in the Industrial Revolution in Britain, then there is increase of the total factor productivity. But there is one-off increase of total factor productivity. You cannot increase it more than once with division of labor. When the labor is completely divided, then that is then expires all the total factor productivity increases. This is known as Smithian growth, as Adam Smith was one of those economists whose insight is that the division of labor, specialization, in other words, is actually one of the factors, the main factor of productivity growth. The other type of growth is innovation-based growth, and it is technological progress and its implementation that is the main source of the total factor productivity increase. So basically it is new products and the new ways to produce the products that makes total factor productivity increases. And the crucial precondition is actually the motive and the freedom of innovation. Freedom of innovation is very important, as pointed out by Mokyr in his seminal book. And it is actually protection of intellectual property rights that are much more important than the straightforward rule of law. There is something known as creative destruction. Creative destruction is done by entrepreneurs who are purposely destroy the existing structure to bring a new one. And that means a continuous increase of total factor productivity, so-called Schumpeterian growth, in honor to Joseph Schumpeter Austrian economist of the 20th century, who spent substantial part of his life actually in the UK and then in America, in the US. Now, this is the basic engine of growth of the countries that are close to the technological frontier. So with increase of the level of development, with closing to the technological frontier, the engines of growth are changing. One engine displaces the other, the previous one. Now, this is known, that process is known as the middle income convergence trap. And perhaps the most important consequence of the middle income convergence trap deals with optimal institutions, as demonstrated by Acemoglu, Aghion, and Zilibotti in their 2006 paper. So what they're saying is that with closing to the technological frontier, the optimal institution setup changes, because the institutions that are good for investment-based growth, meaning lack of competition and huge returns on capital as incentive for investments, that requests for no competition policy, the huge economic rents must be preserved, and basic rule of law, in other words, that the profits should not be extracted from entrepreneurs, extracted by either predators from the public sector, i.e. extensive taxation, or predators from the private sector, i.e. through various criminal activities. The institutions that are good for innovation-based growth are quite different. They are institutions that provide for intensive competition, because it is a competition pressure that is the main incentive for research and development. And actually, innovations are produced by research and development. They are not falling from the sky. And actually, it is protection of intellectual property rights that is important for research and development, for these outcomes to be protected and then to be turned into economic rents. So a basic insight of this seminal paper is that the institutions that are good for investment-based growth are not necessarily good for innovation-based growth. Actually, they are bad for innovation-based growth. If you think of a country which is in the middle income convergence trap, think about China. Think about China. Maybe that convergence trap, no, obviously that convergence trap did not come yet, but this is the kind of trap that China could expect to happen in years to come. So what I propose is a modification of Acemoglu, Aghion, and Zilibotti. So what I'm proposing is actually changing a fundamental explanation of economic growth with closing to technological frontiers. So appropriate institutions are the primarily explanation of successful investment-based growth. In other words, growth success of the countries that are far away from technological frontier. Those culture matters. But more important are institutions. But appropriate culture is the primary explanation of successful investment-based growth, i.e. for growth success of countries that are far from the technological, that are close to technological frontier. Though also institutions matter. Also institutions matter, but as in the previous case, culture matters, now institution only matters, but that's not the primary explanation of that success. Now, according to this theoretical suggestion, there is a dynamic takeover of primary fundamental explanation of economic growth that occurs with closing to the technological frontier, i.e. with the increasing level of economic development of the country. So, one conclusion is that they are complementary after all, and that complementarity can be seen through various points of view. So, complementarity as the rules of the game, because culture provides some rules for interaction. So the rules for interaction, the rules of the game can be rules based on institutions and rules based on culture. So there is a complementarity in causality. Let's think about two-way causality and reinforcement of good solution, like the solution in the case of the labor market. So this is good solution. There is a complementarity in explanation of the outcomes. So some outcomes can be up to a point explained by institutions, that then it can also be explained up to a point by culture. So it was just demonstrated that there is a dynamic complementarity in explanation of economic growth as the country moves from the lower level of development, from being far away from the frontier, technological frontier, and closing the technological frontier. But that on that path, there is a change of complementarity, in the sense that one explanation becomes more important than the other one. So there is what is very interesting is there is a dynamic interaction of culture and institutions, because there is obviously two-way causality from cultures to institutions and from institutions to culture. So generally, this is a very rich picture of explanations, direct and indirect explanations. So basically, I would agree with the insight provided by Bissen and Verdier in their 2017 paper, that there is no need for unique fundamental cause of the outcomes, especially complex outcomes like economic growth is. So the other thing that is important is that it seems to me that misunderstanding between proponents of institutions and proponents of culture, that misunderstanding is still bigger than disagreement between the two. So let's try to conclude the third part of the presentation and the presentation itself. So what would be guidelines for the future? I would definitely subscribe to Popperian methodological nominalism. So let's try to understand each other. Let's try to make a convention what we are talking about. So the debate should be about differences of insights, not about misunderstanding. And in that sense, Popperian type of methodological nominalism would help. The room for empirical research in all the areas of economics is now much bigger than it was. So the impact of culture and institutions to economic growth, now it can be measured by empirical research with the new data set and better econometric methods. And what is interesting, that kind of two-way causality from institutions to culture and from culture to institutions, that creates the possibility of multiple dynamic equilibrium models with good and bad equilibrium. So what can be or should be expected is more empirical research on relations between institutions and culture. Including experimental economics, a rather new field which provides new insights on relations between many things, and that relations between institutions and the culture is, that kind of relation is obvious candidate for experimental economics. So at the end of the day, it could be for economic history a new task for economic history, so to explore these relations in history, and perhaps the task for somewhat disappearing discipline of comparative economics, as the capitalism is now alone, so comparative economics could be redirected to the research of that kind. So that concludes my three-tier presentation, and I would like to thank you. I would like to thank you for opportunity to address BRLCI audience. That was really an honor and a privilege, and I'm grateful to Penny Law, who initiated actually this lecture, and I'm grateful to Penny and Andreas and David for the support in preparing this lecture. So stay well, be safe, and be responsible regarding COVID-19. And I do hope that we will see each other. So see you in Bath next, hopefully corona-less time. Meanwhile, there is a photo just for you to know how I look like. So the time when we see in a few years, I will still be gray and I will still wear glasses. Again, thank you very much and all the best to all of you.